Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about something that I've been involved in for over 30 years. And it's been exciting to see the prospect for where it's going and the accomplishments of those that have put it into practice. The point of this talk, this brief talk today, is to give us a sense, an overview of kind of the history in a brief way of where did this come from and where might it be going and what makes it different from other theories of justice or other approaches to justice. Restorative justice is about parties who have conflict of some sort or another. It may be defined as crime. It may be defined as a community conflict. It may just simply be defined as, two neighbors who just aren't getting along. And as a result of that, instead of taking care of it on their own, we give it over to the state or the experts to solve the problem for us. Early on, those in the local communities found ways to handle the conflict within themselves or within their own community. As that conflict became increasingly relevant for the state to take control over in early England, what used to be restitution between people that were working out, if you take my cow, you owe me a cow, you owe me 500 shilling or whatever, or pence, whatever it is. The state then began saying, hey, that's some money we could take as a fine. And so restitution becomes a fine that the state usurps. And not just that, but the shift in general becomes from local community control over everything from taxes to conflicts to the state. And this paradigm shift, or this notion of a shift from a restorative model to a retributive model, that is, the state becomes, Nils Christie, a Scandinavian, Swedish criminologist, says that what happened in terms of conception of justice, if I were to go around and ask you, what is justice? Fairness, getting what you deserve, those kinds of things. Somewhere along the way, according to Christie and others, the state began to define justice as finding a just measure of pain and applying it appropriately. So pain for pain. In essence, you hurt them, we hurt you. And it is removed from the local community and taken over by the state. If we put these two paradigms, the restorative, the traditional, and when I say traditional, I'm talking about way back when. We're talking about tribal, we're talking about indigenous, we're talking about small group, community, where that worked before the rise of the larger state. We can put these two paradigms side by side, and they ask different questions. And obviously, when you ask different questions, you're going to get a different model. So in the traditional retributive, or I'm sorry, in the retributive that took the place of the restorative model, it's very specific. What laws were broke, who broke them, and what does the statute say should be the punishment? That's kind of the formula for justice. Once we lose, once we give up our power and the state takes it over. In the restorative paradigm, there are different questions, and these are important because they define where we go with this, and why restorative justice, I believe, is beginning to make, or is continuing to make inroads into that traditional or that retributive model. Restorative model asks different questions. Who was hurt? Not what law was broken. Who was hurt? Who's responsible for that? And how do we best hold that person accountable? it's not a one-size-fits-all formula that gets applied. There's even a fourth question, and that is, how do we keep this from happening again? So you've got this different way of asking questions. And during that development of the modern use of restorative justice, in the 80s there was an interest in, we had overcrowding, prison riots, there was a dissatisfaction with the prison system, the criminal justice system. It was overcrowded, it was unfairly utilized, victims were not feeling like they were part of the system. So there was a movement in the 80s to try different things. So some individuals, quote unquote, discovered restorative justice, although, as we know, it goes back many, many eons. And the focus was on how do we move back to affecting the victim. The state, which owned the conflict, or which had the conflict, essentially only needed the victim if they needed them to testify. They were only useful if they could testify. Yeah, we'll let you speak at the sentencing if you can. We'll give you that right. But why is it that only 10 to 11% actually do that? Very, very few actually show up and do that. Again, that feeling of being marginalized on the edges. Yeah, we can order restitution. Put your bills in, and we'll make it an order. So I've seen. So a third, at most, get paid, and crime victims see the criminal justice system as kind of an insurance vendor. That if I lost $3,000, I get $3,000. Not if your perpetrators are two 14-year-olds. And so a lot of restitution doesn't get paid. That creates dissatisfaction further with the system. So they're marginalized, and it's even when we talk about victims. Crime victims, there's two injuries. One is the first injury perpetrated by the offenders. The second injury is the one that's perpetrated by the courts and the system itself by only using them as necessary, not really reaching out to them because of the paradigm, which is it's our crime. The state owns it. It's our rules. Here's the law. We prove it. Here's the penalty. Go directly to jail. The victim, the victim's family, the community, the offender's family, all of those individuals are part of the problem that has to be addressed, and that's what restorative justice in the early days was trying to do. So this attempt in the 80s to begin to bring that back emphasized this notion of how do we empower victims to feel like they have a say in what's going on and what's happening to them. They've been injured, they've been hurt, and there was consternation amongst the judicial system saying, you can't do that. That's our job. There was kind of a tug of war over the offenders, over whose system would they be heard under, and so a lot of the early systems were diversion. Okay, these are the people that we probably don't have enough evidence for, or we can't. We're not going to prosecute them, so you can deal with them. And those creating these programs talk about what do victims need? And we learned victims need to be heard. They need to hear an apology. They need to be able to express their anger. They need to find emotional closure. They need restitution that makes amends in a meaningful way. The offender needs to be held accountable. How can this be constructed in such a way that the offender knows what they've done, that they've been hurt, the victim is able to have some closure, and how can it be creative? One of the first cases that I did was two young men who had, on a Friday night, gone out on their four-wheel truck and drove up and down the lawn out in the country. They broke into the garage, had some beer, and just decided to ram trees, and cross, knock over trees and whatever. And the restorative program was, okay, you're going to meet these people, and the victim always has the say whether they want to or not, or where they want to meet. In this case, they felt like they wanted the boys to come to their place. And they talked about it, and one of the interesting things that we see often when offenders try to make excuses or rationalize, which is one of the ways that they're able to continue to do it, is, well, we were drunk, as if that is the be-all and end-all of explanations. And interestingly, in every case I've seen, you have victims who are, you say, tough. This is still what happened. You're on the hook. You should have been smarter. And yes, you can lecture them from a judge, but when it's the offender talking, or I'm sorry, the victim talking, it carries more weight. So at about half hour into the meeting, when it came time to talk about restitution, the mom and dad said, let's walk outside. And so here they had fixed up a lot of the grooves in the lawn, but there were three trees that had been knocked down, and the parents told a story. They said, you know, each of these trees we planted for one of our children. There was an apple tree and a pine tree and something else, and it was symbolic, important to them. And they wanted the boys, and this became part of the restitution contract, to go with them and their children and to pick out new trees, to plant them, to learn how to plant them if they didn't know how, to plant them, to water them, to see it through the summer so that they would live. And in the course of that, it was an eye-opener for the young men who had no concept, first of all, how much trees cost. Secondly, how hard it is to keep a tree alive during a drought. And secondly, they were shocked that neighbors came over and talked to them and said, we just wanted to meet you. So you had the community, the neighborhood becoming more involved in this situation. And if you want information in terms of the value of the outcomes, I've done a lot of outcome research. You can go to the website that I have and go to the links that talk about recidivism, talk about victim satisfaction with the process. They're all very, very positive outcomes. But the reason it hasn't been used more frequently is because the state ownership of crime and conflict we've given away, and it's difficult to take that back because there's so many vested interests that have that. That same story, what if there hadn't been that option? Well, you'd have probably the judge order $3,000 of restitution, which would never have gotten paid, and then technically would be a probation violation. They didn't have the money. They could maybe have earned it over the years. So $3,000 restitution, 10 days in JDC, take a drug or anger management class, and whatever that cost is, and victims pretty dissatisfied with that kind of an outcome. And the cost of the state, the cost of the community would be fairly substantial for those kinds of programs. If this alternative approach is cost effective and in fact has better outcomes, then there are those who'd argue that it should be used more frequently. The last point I want to make is kind of moving ahead now. Because restorative justice, which when it was first implemented, really was focusing on the justice system. You had an offender or offenders, you had a mediator, or what I would call a facilitator, somebody who would help them have a conversation over what needed to be done. Now what we see is a larger group becoming involved in the offense or in the harm or in the crime. So we're seeing it move into school settings. We're seeing it move into employer-employee settings. We're even seeing it move into hospitals where you have patients who are dealing with medical mistakes and they're mad. It doesn't mean not everybody wants to sue the doctor, but they do want to know, how is this not going to happen again? So we've set up circles there to bring in the doctors, the nurses, the family, the patient. The University of Michigan is a leader in setting these things up and using the restorative practice model for this. I'll just close with one story. A boy who, two boys at a middle school here, and it just so happened that the principal took one of my classes, and so we got to talking, and one of the boys had keyed the teacher's car, and a teacher's car, and the other boy had then keyed it worse and gone over it worse. And so they were both angry, scared, and okay, you go to the principal's office. And so they just kept going to the principal's office, and nothing really changed. Well, it turns out when we had the circle, we invited the teacher, the principal, the two boys, their parents, their classmates, some of their classmates that knew both of them. And as we talked in this process, it turns out that the first boy had written an obscenity on the side of the teacher's car. And the second boy was friends with this guy and also liked the teacher a lot. So he was trying to protect her from having to see this horrible word, so he scratched it all out. And none of that could come out until there was a conversation about what happened that day, where people were able to talk and then to deal with, what do we do from here? You're not bad kids. What kind of reparation? And so they worked it out. They found something reasonable. It was washing the teachers' cars and doing some things like that, which was much more productive than just sitting in an office. So using it in anti-bullying programs, using it in school classroom settings, it simply is a return to a very traditional approach to involving those most connected to the harm, settling it, figuring it out themselves. I think we're more creative and more productive than we give ourselves credit for, and I think we can do a better job in the justice system than continually keying each other's cars. Thank you.